Hi, everybody. How's everyone doing? Good? Good. Okay. Well, I'm Samir Khan, and I'm a Senior Research and Evaluation Associate at the Future Skills Center, which is a center housed within Toronto Metropolitan University and funded by the federal government. And it's tasked with supporting dialogue, funding pilot programs, and research just about what we should be training for in the future of our economy as workers. So I've been asked to talk about advancing work as it relates to what is probably one of the big challenges I think we'd agree in this room. I hope we agree in this room. And that is, how do we address the changes that climate change is going to wreak on our societies and on our economies? And how do we avoid the worst impacts of it while hopefully mitigating some of what we think is going to be the worst case scenario? And that's a big topic, and I have to admit I was really nervous about doing this talk because unlike my esteemed colleagues here, I'm not on the front lines of environmental movement. I'm not a clean tech entrepreneur. I'm like a policy wonk who reads lots of reports and goes to webinars, talks to people. So what I have to share is, I think, some messages that I think hopefully you can take and use and think about when you think about climate change and you think about who you want to influence change around. Some messages to remind people and to hold people to account for what is really going on and what might be some of the implications we need to be thinking about for people who are going to live through this change. So the first point, and I feel like it's a safe space here. I feel like most people probably know this, but maybe you don't. But there are a bunch of viable scenarios now, like really viable scenarios in which Canada can get to net zero within a certain time frame, and that Canada's economy and that Canadian workers actually thrive. And that sounds like a good news story. I think for some people, maybe that's a little bit controversial. It can be hard to wrap your head around because it has been, I think, easy to say that decarbonization, because of the way we use energy, is just not incompatible with economic growth and incompatible with a flourishing of the workforce. But we now have several very complicated economic models done by some colleagues I'm looking around here in this room who have been responsible for some of them, that show that we can get there if we do certain things in a certain way, if we have the right mix of policies, if technology continues to advance. And it's not just looking forward in econometric models about our future. If we look at the last 15 years, there is a good news story buried between all the bad news stories about what we're beginning to see are the impacts of climate change. There's a really interesting study that showed in something like 30 countries, they've successfully been able to grow their economies while at the same time reducing emissions. And this is true for rich countries like the US and Japan. It's true for middle-income countries like Mexico. It's true for low-income countries like Jamaica and El Salvador. Canada, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, is not at this level, and that's really unfortunate. We can talk about why that's the case. But if we look at those countries that are successfully doing what we think is the right thing to do, there's some interesting things to observe. So one, the technology has advanced enormously in the last 15 years, and it's not just in the obvious things like wind and solar and batteries. Using gas for certain things as opposed to using coal reduces emissions, right? And that's an important point for us to be thinking about. And as technology begins to change, this should get better and better because no one could have foreseen how good things got 15 years ago from where they are now. Second, policies which have not been aggressive enough, where they've been implemented, have actually influenced change. So we have carbon taxes, which are not aggressive enough. We have regulations that have come on to bear that have not been aggressive enough. But they haven't damaged the economy, and quite the opposite. People have been able to grow their economies, as I mentioned, and decarbonize somewhat. And then the third point I want to make about why this might be the case, why our economy is growing, it's because all of this adoption of new technology, integrating it into the way our economy functions, requires workers. It requires people to build infrastructure. It requires people to learn new technologies. It requires people to do things like carbon audits and think about linkages between different problems that we need to be solving. And that all creates work, and that can't be done by a robot yet. That's a people job. And so for those reasons, I think that there's a lot of reasons to see that this is actually a viable possibility, and I think we should be mindful of that. Point number 2, and this is where it begins to be like in the if sort of range, we need to be thinking about whether we have people who know how to do what needs to be done. So I don't know if any of you have bought heat pumps recently and struggled to find a qualified technician, or let's say you got your hands on an electric car and you can't find somebody in a certain time frame to be able to install the high-speed charger. Those are just like 2 obvious examples. If we think about all the things that need to transform in our economy, they're all people bottlenecks, people who need skills, who need the abilities to kind of think about how those things are going to change. And we aren't there yet, to be honest. And that is one of the things that's really important. That's one thing that we're really focused on at the Future Skills Center. The good news is that most of us have the ability, with a little bit of training, to be able to get there. No matter what we're doing, there is, I swear to you, probably some sort of decarbonization angle that you probably haven't thought of. And with a bit of training, whether you're a tradesperson, whether you're working in finance, you can get there. But that training takes time, it takes money, and that gets me to the last point I might want to make, which is we can't just jump ahead without addressing the needs of those who will be left behind. So if you think about somebody who's in the middle of their career and needs to transform what they do, we need to be thinking about what their obligations are to their family, to their household, where they live. And so if we're telling them they need to go and retrain, we need to provide them a pathway to make that viable for them to do. And that is something that we have not done historically in Canada, and something we need to really be thinking about. And this means more than just paying tuition. This means thinking about the cost of living. Like, where do you need to be to receive training, to take part in this new economy? If you're in a rural or remote community, working in forestry and oil and gas, where are you going to access that opportunity to retrain? We know that the impacts of the sustainable transition are going to be uneven. I think one of the things I've learned when I've been reading some of these reports is that Indigenous peoples actually make up a disproportionate number of people working in mining. Visible minorities are also a disproportionate number of people working in the oil and gas sector in Alberta. And so if we're telling everybody that they need to prepare for the future, we need to think also about those people who are living there right now and think about the systemic barriers that they already face. And as we ask people to come with us on the journey, we need to make sure that that future is inclusive of their needs as well. So in conclusion, I hope that some of the things I've been able to share convey a bit of an optimism about climate change, because it can very easily be something that feels very heavy-hearted and is impossible to solve. I assure you that there are a bunch of challenges, again, with the caveats around the if. And it's not a matter about being Pollyannish. I think this is a matter of thinking about the nuts and bolts of all the serious challenges we need to face and advocating from our leaders that they take those steps and lead us to that future. And so I thank you for inviting me to speak.